Hey, what's up, folks? Welcome back to On Texas Football. I'm lifetime Longhorn Rod Babers. Pleased to be joined by fellow lifetime Longhorn CJ Vogel, and of course, the man who needs no introduction, the newest member of the On Texas Football family, my man Jeff Howe. We are here to go over our spring football position previews. We've already done quarterback and tight end. Now we're going to take a look at the offensive line during today's position preview. And today's position preview brought to you by our friends over at TackleAddict.com. That's tackleaddict.com. Get your tackle on with tackleaddict.com, and we'll give you a special message from our friends at Tackle Addict a little bit later on here during this video. But first, gentlemen, let's dive into it. Losing 4 starters on the offensive line. Usually, if you're talking about losing 4 starters on the offensive line, usually there'd be a lot of anxiety going into the season about that O-line. But I think there's been a lot of optimism considering how the Longhorns have been stacking talent on this offensive line for the last few years, and they've had really good retention, keeping most of those guys in the program. Now we'll see if they see the benefits of those developmental projects on the offensive line. Let's start overall with you guys' thoughts. CJ, you first, about the replacing 4 starters on the offensive line for Kyle Flood.
Yeah, well, it certainly isn't easy. Right. You know, the big part of 2024 and going into the season was the strength of the offensive line. For the most part, you had 4 returners with a 5th having a full season of starting experience under his belt with Cole Hudson. Cam Williams made the leap and by all means, I think played pretty darn well to be considered a day 2, possibly day 1 pick after the combine. So they lived up to what you would hoped, maybe left a little meat on the bone, but that's neither here nor there. The point being, now it's kind of flipped because this is more of an unknown. And I wanted to go through what I think is the projected offensive line starting depth chart. And we've talked about it previously, what we think that starting 5 might look like. Trevor Goosby, Nato Umeozulu, Cole Hudson, DJ Campbell, and of course, Brandon Baker. We're expecting to make that jump into the starting lineup as well. Well, look, you got 2 starts with Trevor Goosby. You don't have a single start with Brandon Baker. You have no starts with Nato Umeozulu. You got 13 with Cole Hudson, again, coming in really his freshman campaign. And you got 30 with DJ Campbell. So he's really, in Cole, you can say maybe 1.5, 2 full returners there. It's going to be a new unit. But I think, again, the big part, and I made an article on Texas football earlier in the offseason. You look at what Ohio State, Penn State, and Notre Dame were able to do with their offensive lines. Yeah, they had to plug and play in some new cats in their offensive lines, but they're all old, right? Age on the offensive line is like having a veteran point guard in college basketball. It means a lot. And for the most part, Texas will be having an older offensive line. Despite some of the inexperience, I think that the age is something that you can take away as a positive going into this year. Kyle Flood's a great developer, and they'll certainly have a number of years in the past to develop and mold into the offensive line, and that he hopes see fit for this upcoming offensive line.
Yeah, good point, Jeff. You got 1,000 snaps for a couple of guys returning on this offensive line for Texas, although not starters, but they do have guys with quality experience, as CJ's mentioned.
Yeah, no freshmen are going to be asked to come in and be starters right off the jump, right? Brandon Baker is the only second-year guy, and he got to have, a developmental year, redshirt year, which I'm still glad. Look, for so long, Texas was in this cycle of having to play true freshman offensive linemen because they had nobody else. And you can go back over history and think, really goes back to David Snow was kind of the first one I think of. There was a highly recruited offensive lineman, but he had to play early. And then Trey Hopkins had to play early. And then Kent Perkins had to play early. Connor Williams, Patrick Vahe. It was this never-ending cycle. Well, now you're out of that cycle. You're not having to do that anymore. So Brandon Baker actually got a year to develop, knowing that he probably wasn't going to be asked to play because we know Goosby was the number 3 tackle. He's the only second-year guy. Those interior guys are all 4-year guys. And then Goosby's going into year 3. So, like you said, CJ hit the nail on the head. In terms of starts, it might look like an inexperienced line, but these are guys that have been in a college strength and conditioning program. They've been at the training table. They've been on road trips. They've dressed out. They've gotten to watch NFL-bound players. They've been in this thing for a long time. So I like the limit, even in the limited experience we've seen from a guy like Goosby. We've liked what we've seen. I've liked what I've seen. The question I have is, are Sark and Kyle Flood going to try to force a run game identity with this group, or are they going to let it happen organically? Because the difference is Kyle Flood hasn't been in this position where he's basically got to remake the whole offensive line in terms of your starting five. Hadn't been in this situation since going from 2021 to 22. Like, we knew Kelvin Banks was going to be one of those guys. You brought back Jake Majors. Hayden Connor was a starter all of a sudden, but you had to remake that offensive line. Now you're having to do it again. At the time, though, Rod, you didn't really need to hone in on a run game staple. You didn't need to hone in on a run game identity because your backs were your run game identity with Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson. You don't have that luxury now. So, last year Sark talked all about outside zone. Well, maybe that's not what it is with this group. Maybe it's inside zone. Maybe it's going to be more of a gap power scheme, heavy run game with this offensive line. I just hope that they let it develop organically so that you can figure out what this line does best rather than just trying to pigeonhole them into something or force them into something. And I got to feel like Sark and Kyle Flood are flexible enough to let it happen organically.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Last year, of course, and for the last 2 years, Texas has been predominantly a zone blocking unit, probably about 55-45 on the season. But last 7 weeks, I believe, of the season, when they really found their kind of groove in the running game, it was 60% zone blocking for that group. And I just think we are kind of stereotyped the big humans on the offensive line. I've said this several times. Because they were big, we assumed they were going to maul opponents at the line of scrimmage, and they really didn't do that. They were more of a finesse offensive line, great at pass blocking, great in the zone blocking concepts. But maybe this group will be different. Maybe in the mentality, maybe in the skill set. I talked to Trevor Gooseby a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him, I said, do you like zone blocking in the run game, or you like gap power schemes? He said, oh, gap power, no doubt. Gap power. So he wants to basically just, haul off on one defender and be able to maul that guy and pancake that guy. And so maybe there will be a different mentality with this group when it comes to the overall run game. The running backs and the health of those guys, I think that also plays a role. Cedric Baxter and Trey Wisner, very different running backs. Those are going to be your two bell cows. So they could get a lot of variety in the run game. I think ultimately that's what you need. So teams by the end of the season can't just figure out, hey, this team is great at wide zone. Stop the wide zone, and you can stop the running game, period.
I really like that idea of some guards pulling. Just kick them out. We saw it a little bit against Clemson, and it was more, to your point, that wide spread or that wide zone. And it was DJ Campbell just pushing guys out of the way, right? Just completely taking them off the screen. That's what he does very well in the run game. And I'm just imagining, a unexpected edge waiting in the hole looking like they're going to have a tackle for loss, and you're going to have either Nato Umeozulu or DJ Campbell pulling across and just whacking them. Yeah, I like that idea because I think that fits what both of them do very well. It's not necessarily don't think, just go hit, but that's exactly what I'm hoping that we see a little bit more of, because that's pretty easy for these offensive linemen at this size. And look, we'll talk about how big some of these guys are on the offensive line. DJ Campbell last year played around 335 pounds. Nato Umeozulu, right around 325, 330. You got some big guys, I think, that fit that run grading edge as well. I look at Cole Hudson, who out of high school was in a triple option offense. He's used to playing with a flat back, exploding off the ball and moving several bodies at a time at center. Will he have more of an opportunity to do that consistently? I hope so. And when teamed up with the two guys that we're expecting to be starting opposite sides of him, I like that interior, and I think it bodes better in 25 than it did in 24 when it comes to the strengths of the individual players to create running lanes for next year's rushing attack.
And until this line gets some experience playing together, it takes a long time for an offensive line to become a really good zone blocking unit. So I think maybe at least early on, especially you think about going into the opener in Columbus where noise is going to be an issue, communication is going to be an issue. You probably want to have a little simplified run game, diversity in it, but simplified. And for these guys, gap power schemes are typically easier for offensive linemen to master first. So I wouldn't be surprised, Rod, if in that Ohio State game, I know we're talking about spring ball, but just thinking ahead to Ohio State, if we don't see this offense in a horseshoe rely really heavily on gap power schemes.
Yeah, it's interesting. The last two opponents the Longhorns played, they both ended up heavily relying on gap power schemes. Arizona State did it because of their identity. But then Ohio State as well, when they had the injuries on the O-line, to your point, Jeff, they had to replace some starters on the O-line, and they figured, the simplest solution is the best solution for us. Let's just go with gap power schemes, and it really gave their running game a bit of a boost late in the season. Let's talk about the projected starters that you brought up earlier, CJ, and talk about the depth chart behind those guys. You're trying to get your best 5 on the field, and that's something I think Kyle Flood can do because he's cross-trained a lot of these guys to try to make sure you can kind of maximize your talent at those positions. The starting 5 seems pretty simple, or at least you got your best 6. But what's behind those guys, I think, is going to be really more of a challenge to try to figure out for Kyle Flood and for Sark.
Yeah, when I think about I think about the guys that have waited their time to get their opportunities to step forward and be a part of the 2 deep. A guy like Jaden Chapman, who's trained at both tackle spots and both guard spots. So you got a guy that could pretty much anywhere but center. You can stick Jaden Chapman and feel like you've got a guy that you can rely on for depth purposes. Andre Kojo has been almost exclusively a tackle, but same deal. He's a guy that's waited his turn a couple of years. The interesting thing too, CJ, is are there any of the younger guys that fit? We heard really good things about Nate Kibble last year during his redshirt year. Nick Brooks, the reviews for Nick Brooks have already been really good. At least the early returns from winter conditioning have. I think, Rod, as you start to set out your 2 deep on the offensive line, and we know, look, you can read what the 2 deep says, but we'll all figure out, hey, there's going to be a number 3 tackle. There's going to be a number 3 guard. There's going to be a swing guy that can do both. And ideally you have a backup center. I like the depth at center, but that position to me is what this depth chart hinges on. If Cole Hudson's your number 1 center, it becomes a lot easier for Kyle Flood to fill the rest of that thing out. But if Cole Hudson's not, if he decides that, hey, somebody else is a better option, or Rod, you and I have talked about this, if there's, depending on how the spring goes, if there's a center option available in the portal, is that something Kyle Flood could look at? I wouldn't completely write it off, but I think a lot hinges on, does Cole Hudson grab the bull by the horns and win that job? If he does, that is the best case scenario for Kyle Flood and his offensive line.
I totally agree. Again, you start looking at what this interior line might look like. I mean, you mentioned Nate Kibble. Could he be a guy that pushes a DJ Campbell or Nato Umeozulu? Again, we've all sat here and waited 4 years for Nato to become the guy at one of the guard positions, and right now he's pegged to be that guy. But we've heard some really positive things about Nate Kibble. Could they clash? Could they push for a starting spot? Or, hey, is it just the experience and the time at the position previously for Cole Hudson that says you have to throw him back at a guard spot, and we'll just find a center, whether that be Portal, whether that be Connor Robertson, whether it be a Daniel Cruz, because we know that the staff really likes him as well. That's going to be really interesting. At tackle, again, feels pretty solidified. You got Brandon Baker. You got Trevor Gooseby. I think left tackle is probably the most set in stone position right now when you consider the depth chart. But hey, I'm not going to leave Andre Kojo completely out of this just yet. Again, a guy that's been in the program multiple years. He's got a year up on a Brandon Baker. Maybe doesn't have the 5-star pedigree coming in like a Brandon Baker, but hey, again, we've talked about experience. We've talked about being in the program with a Kyle Flood. Does that extra year of weight training, of spring football, of fall camp and traveling, does that kind of correlate to having a leg up in this competition? We'll see, of course, but to the point y'all made earlier, Rod, you got to like the pieces that Kyle Flood and Steve Sarkisian can work with, because talent aplenty and bodies are bountiful. You got to like both of that whenever you come down to finding the best 5.
It does help to have left tackle, the most important position, the anchor of the offensive line, solidified. Jeff, what are your thoughts about kind of the rest of that offensive line and the depth on it? Looks like Trevor Goose was a guy that can play left or right tackle for you, but looks like you talked about Brandon Baker, he being the youngest, maybe the most inexperienced on the O-line, but Sark thinks he's got one of the highest ceilings of that group.
Yeah, I wonder if, the 2 young guys that we talked about, can they be factors in this? That'd be Nick Brooks and Nate Kibble. Can either one of those guys be a factor? CJ mentioned Daniel Cruz, and I think it's worth mentioning, everybody's excited. I haven't heard anybody in the program, on or off the record, that's anything but optimistic about Daniel Cruz's future. I just think at this point, you've got a veteran in Cole Hudson who I think has at least earned the right to go win the job. I feel like as a veteran, he's done that. And I'll tell you what, I'm excited for Cole Hudson and DJ Campbell as seniors, because now they're no longer the young kids or even like a classmate like Kelvin Banks playing, taking a back seat. Those guys are going to be counted on for leadership, and everyone's going to be looking at them because they're the most experienced guys in that room. So I'm excited for the 2025 season for both those guys. But even as a backup center, Connor Robertson, let's not forget, he played it. Go back to the 23 season. Jake Majors gets hurt, 4 or 5 plays into the OU game, and Connor Robertson basically plays the entire game. And I don't think played that bad. The goal line stand that OU had was not all on him, and we've broken that thing down, cussed and discussed it, for the last almost 2 years since it happened. But I thought he played pretty well, all things considered. Rod, you played in that game. For a young guy to just come cold off the bench in that game at an important position like center, I felt like he held his own. So I say all that to say you've got a little bit of a buffer before you have to play Daniel Cruz. In other words, if we see Daniel Cruz in 2025, it should be because he's the best option, not just because you're optimistic about his future and let's see what it looks like. You've got a little bit of a buffer. The 2 guys that I'm not saying they're attrition candidates, okay? So I want everybody to understand that. But actually, I'll put 3. Those guys, that group of Andre Kojo, Jaden Chapman, and Malik Agbo. It's kind of now or never for those guys. If they're going to make moves up the depth chart, they need to do it now. And I do wonder, Rod, especially with Malik Agbo, he was so good in that 6th line role in 2023 that I wonder if that role becomes prominent in the offense again, which again, a lot of that goes back to our discussion on tight ends. What happens with Spencer Shannon? Can you be versatile enough to run 12 personnel? Do you have to modify it and put an extra alignment on the field? Would that be enough to entice Malik Agbo to not enter the portal if he's not competing for a job in the 2 deep or a starting position? So that there's still a lot to be determined to me outside of just who your starting 5 are. The good news is, unlike some springs we've seen at Texas, guys, we feel confident that they're going to find 5 pretty good players to put together a number 1 offensive line. And you should have 5 guys that you feel really good about your 2 deep. And at the very least, Kyle Flood should have in that neighborhood of 6 to 8 guys he feels comfortable putting on the field. So I like the pieces. Now it's just about getting them on the table and figuring out what this puzzle is going to look like.
I'll add one more name to that, Jeff. Where does Connor Stroh kind of figure into his development as well? Because we've talked about, he's a big body. He's been at right guard. He's a guy that, maybe you'd hope would be a guy developmentally down the line, would find way into that 2 deep. He was injured last spring. This spring will be big to see if he can get back into that conversation for being a 2 deep guy or even pushing a NATO or a DJ. Like, we'll see. But that was one other name that I wanted to mention as well. Really, that whole recruiting class, we just waiting to see them all kind of click and find their role.
Rod, I'm glad that our offensive line conversations over the years have changed drastically to wondering, hey, is this group going to be responsible for, the mortality rate of your quarterbacks climbing, to now it's like, hey, you got a handful of guys. Let's see which 5 can make this work the best. It's a great problem to have right now.
Yeah, one of those first world problems Sark talks about, right? Crying from a yacht, pretty much. We've talked about the tackle positions and the depth there and center. Great job there, Jeff. But let's talk about the guard positions, the left and right guard. We know that Cole Hudson, of course, where he ends up is going to play a huge role in what happens to those guard positions. Let's talk about the depth chart between those guys, those positions, the left and right guard. You got obviously DJ Campbell at one spot. And Neto is going to be a key, obviously a key cog for you at that other guard spot. But what about behind those guys?
Yeah, that to me is, you talk about finding, a third option at tackle. Who's the third guard? Is it a Cole Hudson, right? Do you feel like you have the necessary depth at center to move Cole around if one of those guys goes down? If not, that to me screams Nate Kibble. And if it's not Nate Kibble, like, look, we've talked about, Connor Stroh. We've talked about Nick Brooks. Do those guys figure into the conversation? But I think you really like what you have right now with Nate Kibble, with a guy like Cole Hudson and his versatility. You have some options there again, but my goodness, the starters of NATO and DJ, I talked about it earlier in the episode. Look, I think they're road graders by choice, right? That's just who they are. They get up in the morning, they say, who can I move out of my way to get to where I got to go? That's just kind of what they do. They got the bodies for it. They got the mindset for it. That's going to be tough to replace if either goes down. We'll see what they look like in pass protection. By now, DJ, that should be as much of a strength as anything in his game. For NATO, a young guard, he's going to be picked on just as we saw this last year with DJ. So that'll be interesting to see how they develop. But all in all, I think you have some really solid run-moving options with those guard positions.
When I think about especially backup left guard, because right guard, I feel like, DJ Campbell and Nate Kibble. Right guard seems to be the spot where Flood puts guys that might lack experience and I don't know the nuances of how he looks at it internally, but it seems like right guard is the spot that, hey, if you can only play one interior line position, we'll start you at a right guard and then cross-train you from there. Yeah, so I would think maybe Nate Kibble starts there. When you talk about left guard, I look at a guy like Nick Brooks, and I think back to when Kyle Flood was at Alabama. They started Evan Neal inside before they kicked him out to tackle. Because if you think about early on, you didn't really need him to tackle because you had Alex Leatherwood, who was an Outland Trophy winner and a first-round pick. So, but you needed to get Evan Neal in the mix, so they started him out at guard. I wonder if they could do that with Nick Brooks. The other thing, Rod, and this is the fun part for Kyle Flood, is when you start to set your depth chart, now you got to ask yourself, getting back to something CJ mentioned about Cole Hudson, is Cole Hudson really the third guard? When you start looking at your two deep, okay, what's my better combination? Is it keeping Cole Hudson at center and maybe a Nick Brooks or a Nate Kibble or a Connor Stroh at guard? Or is it the winner of a battle between Connor Robertson and Daniel Cruz at center and then put Cole Hudson out at guard? Like, that's the fun. That's when you've got like 8 or so guys that you really trust. Now the fun starts because the combinations can become endless. So that's the thing. Backup center's one position that I'm really wondering how that battle's going to play out, because you got 3 guys there. But that ultimately is going to be that to me will ultimately determine what the two deep truly looks like. Is Cole Hudson, do you need to keep him at center? Or is one of those other centers good enough to where in a pinch you can slide Cole Hudson back over to guard?
Tackle Addict, our friends over at tackleaddict.com. That's right, folks, tackleaddict.com. And by the way, Tackle Addict also owned and operated by legendary lifetime Longhorn Brian Robertson, also former Longhorn baseball great Brandon Belt. Tackle Addict has everything you need for the best in today's fishing equipment. Do yourself a favor and check out tackleaddict.com. If you're an avid fisherman who's always searching for the right supplies, tackleaddict.com is for the everyday fisherman and serious pros alike. Get their products shipped to you directly from the shores of Lake Sam Rayburn. That's tackleaddict.com, ADDICT.com. And Brandon and, of course, my man Brian, they say hook 'em horns. And they appreciate you, and we appreciate them for sponsoring our position previews. All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Knowledge, great stuff as always. Thank you, CJ. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to all you guys out there for joining us. And for our friends over at tackleaddict.com, for Jeff and for CJ, I'm lifetime Longhorn Rod Babers. Until next time, hook 'em horns.